If you watch this entire breakdown and still walk away without committing to see this through, ask yourself what that says about how much you really care about justice. Because a board-certified forensic pathologist just weighed in on the Nolan Wells case, and what she said doesn't match what the public was told in those first crucial hours after his body was recovered. Drowning is a diagnosis of exclusion. That single forensic principle is at the center of tonight's breakdown, and it's the reason Jackson County's early no foul play statement may have gotten ahead of the science. Tonight we bring in Dr. Judy Melinek, a board-certified forensic pathologist with zero connection to either side of this case, and we lay out, accurately in her own words, what she's actually said about the retained neck tissue, the 12 by 8 inch discoloration, the toxicology limitations, and why she says this case will ultimately be decided by the police investigation, not a lab report. We also break down brand new developments announced by Ben Crump at the National Urban League Convention, a formal audio engineering review of the full emergency call, an oceanic tide investigation into where Nolan's body was recovered, a coordinated push to get Dr. Mitchell access to the retained throat tissue, and a joint FBI-assisted forensic phone investigation that now reportedly extends beyond just Nolan's own device. Let's start with the voice that changed the conversation. I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. That context matters because for weeks the public had been handed a story, an accident, a drowning, a tragedy with a simple explanation. But Dr. Melinek didn't see simplicity. She saw a case where the most critical evidence hadn't even been examined yet, where the single piece of anatomy that could answer the biggest question was still sitting in a jar at the medical examiner's office, withheld from the independent review. And she said something that should have been the headline of every news outlet covering this case. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Incredibly unlikely. Those are the words of a board-certified forensic pathologist, someone who has spent her career examining bodies and determining how people died. And she was saying, clearly and without equivocation, that the early conclusion handed to the public was not supported by the science. If you've made it this far, you've already invested something in this story. You've heard Nolan's name. You've heard a forensic expert question the official narrative. You've felt the weight of what his family has been through. And that means you have a choice to make. The world looked away from cases like this for decades. Don't look away now. Every person who subscribes is a witness, and witnesses are what the dead deserve. Let's understand what a diagnosis of exclusion actually means. Drowning is not something a pathologist can simply observe. You cannot look at a body recovered from water and record drowning as the cause of death. Water conceals nearly everything. A person can drown, or they can die from an entirely different cause and subsequently end up in water. Visually, both scenarios can appear almost identical. Therefore, the examiner must work in reverse, eliminating head trauma, cervical injury, toxic substances, internal hemorrhaging, everything first. Only after every alternative explanation has been systematically ruled out can drowning be documented as the determination. That's established protocol. It's not discretionary. Here's how Dr. Melinek explained it in her own words. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that was found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So, for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot. They'll be bleeding. And the gunshot will be the cause of death. The thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water. But the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they are exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning. And the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So, we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. The only way stories like this continue to be told is if people like you choose to care, choose to stay, choose to be part of the community that won't let go. Now let's talk about the piece of evidence that has everyone asking questions: the neck block. When Dr. Mitchell conducted his independent autopsy, the internal neck structures were not provided to him. They had been retained by the initial state pathologist. Here's what Dr. Melinek said about that. The neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So, Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well, if injury comes from behind. But generally, this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So, compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office. That was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the neck anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy. That has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. Let's be precise about what the neck block actually contains. There are 3 particular things a forensic examiner searches for in cases where strangulation is a possibility. First, the hyoid bone, a diminutive, fragile, U-shaped bone positioned high in the anterior throat. Unlike most skeletal structures in the body, it's relatively exposed. And in certain manual strangulation incidents, it can break under force. Second, the infrahyoid muscles, the slender muscles descending along the front of the neck, where microscopic blood vessels can burst internally under constriction. Producing indicators a qualified eye can identify even when nothing is apparent on the exterior. Third, petechiae, the minute hemorrhages that manifest when small vessels rupture from continuous pressure. Frequently discovered in the eyes, the facial tissue, or the cardiac lining. Combined, these 3 indicators create an identifiable pattern, and pattern identification is the cornerstone of forensic pathology. All 3 of those indicators exist in the precise region that was kept and never released. Which leads us to the physician's recent declaration. A pathologist evaluating the obtainable materials could only identify the clear constraint. Without the anterior neck, you cannot verify strangulation, but you similarly cannot eliminate it. That's the dilemma at the center of this case. It isn't that the evidence establishes anything. It's that the evidence capable of resolving the question was never provided to the individuals attempting to resolve it independently. If this case stayed with you, if that missing neck block is still sitting in the back of your mind, if you're wondering what the state found that they won't release, then you already know what you need to do next. Subscribe. Not for us, for him, for every victim who never got to tell their own story. Now let's talk about the 12 by 8 inch discoloration. The second postmortem exam was done on a body that had been several days from being found. So we're dealing with, I believe, 2 days between when Nolan Wells was first missing and when his body was found and then autopsied, and another 4 days that have passed until the second postmortem exam. So the body is decomposed, it falls apart after death, and discoloration could be a sign of injury like bleeding, or it could also be a sign of some sort of pressure being applied potentially during the first autopsy itself. This particular location on the back of the head is a common area where we place a block during the first autopsy. And that may have been the source of the discoloration, and it may have absolutely nothing to do with trauma. The only way to know is to get pieces of tissue under the microscope, and that is something that Dr. Mitchell, the pathologist who did the second autopsy, is going to be doing, to look to see if that discoloration is bleeding or hemorrhage. In part, a first autopsy pathologist might not autopsy that area or dissect that area because they don't see anything on the surface of the skin when the body is fresher. So they don't suspect that there's any trauma there. And they may have other parts of the body that have significant findings that they're focusing their attention on. So it's not unusual for a second autopsy pathologist who is given a body that is starting to decompose to work harder to look at areas that the first pathologist may not have looked at. Because when the body was fresh, they didn't see any external signs of injury. Let's talk about toxicology, because there's a secondary complication in this case that appears straightforward on paper and isn't. A figure on a laboratory report appears objective, but one specific measurement can be profoundly deceptive without anyone being dishonest about it: blood alcohol concentration. In a recent case, a blood alcohol measurement typically represents exactly what it suggests. But this wasn't a recent case, and that transforms the calculation completely. Following death, as a body initiates decomposition, bacteria become operative, and those bacteria can generate alcohol independently, completely separate from anything the individual actually ingested. In bodies that have experienced substantial decomposition, this endogenously produced alcohol can escalate sufficiently to exceed a legal standard based exclusively on bacterial metabolism, not conduct. Considering that Nolan's body remained in water for days before discovery, any toxicology measurement associated with alcohol requires interpretation with that decomposition incorporated, not accepted at nominal value. A meticulous examiner considers the extent of decay, verifies corroborating chemical indicators, and calibrates appropriately. Anyone interpreting a raw figure as confirmation of intoxication without that framework is operating with an insufficient picture. Here's how Dr. Melinek put it. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And to answer the question if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning. But the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to a 0.20 gram percent, so 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving. But you can get up to a 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. If you want to see this through to the end, if you want to be part of the community that made sure this case didn't go cold, if you believe Nolan Wells deserves more than just another news cycle, there's one thing you can do. Subscribe. Not because this channel wants your subscription, but because these stories don't get told without people like you caring, because the algorithm rewards attention, and attention leads to answers. Every subscription is a promise that we will keep digging, that we will not let these cases go cold again. Now let's talk about what this case will ultimately hinge on. I doubt it, Dr. Melinek said when asked whether the toxicology report would answer everything. It's not a single report that answers any question. It can give you a piece of the puzzle, but you really need the scene and the circumstances. What is going to make or break this case is going to be the police investigation. Finding out exactly how he got into the water, whether he was alone, or whether there were other people with him at the time. That's going to make the difference in terms of determining whether it was an accident, as in an accidental drowning, or potentially a homicide. That's a board-certified forensic pathologist saying that the autopsy alone won't solve this case, that the investigation matters as much as the science, that the circumstances of Nolan's final hours are just as critical as the condition of his body. And that brings us back to the gap. the 90-minute window between Nolan's last confirmed sighting around 3 p.m. and the boat's documented departure at 4:31 p.m. What happened on that beach in those 90 minutes is the question no one has answered yet. Now let's talk about what's happening next. Ben Crump announced several new developments at the National Urban League Convention, a formal audio engineering review of the full emergency call, an oceanic tide investigation into where Nolan's body was recovered, a coordinated push to get Dr. Mitchell access to the retained throat tissue, and a joint FBI-assisted forensic phone investigation that now reportedly extends beyond just Nolan's own device. These are not small moves. They represent a family that is not going to stop fighting for answers, a legal team that is systematically pursuing every possible piece of evidence, and a public that is watching to see whether the system will deliver the truth or continue to keep it locked away. Why should anybody do a second autopsy? Dr. Melinek asked. A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office, because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence. They have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. Let's close by being precise about what we know and what we don't. A determination of death cause isn't something you estimate while standing at a recovery site. It's something you conclude only after systematically testing and eliminating every alternative explanation. In this instance, that sequence got reversed before any official examination even commenced. Within days of Nolan going missing, the sheriff leading Jackson County stood before media and announced there was no foul play involved. At that precise moment, no autopsy had been conducted. No pathologist had assessed the body. The investigation was, by every standard, still in its opening stages. Yet the public received a definitive answer as if the matter was already resolved. The sheriff's media statement bypassed the complete process. He provided the conclusion before anyone had examined the evidence. Now, to be fair, perhaps the sheriff observed something at the recovery location that influenced his announcement. But a scene observation isn't a documented, scientifically validated finding. It's not something an external specialist can assess. A statement delivered on camera holds massive influence with the public, regardless of whether it's scientifically substantiated yet. Once authorities declare accident, that characterization follows the case universally. It determines how vigorously evidence gets collected, how the public interprets emerging information, and how much momentum exists to investigate further. You investigate first, you declare second. Here, that sequence was inverted. And once inverted, it's extraordinarily challenging to correct. Three particular actions would advance this case forward. First, the original autopsy documentation itself. The state's recorded findings that could clarify the body's condition and validate why specific tissue was retained initially. Second, the retained cervical tissue, which hasn't been destroyed, merely withheld, indicating an independent credentialed examiner could still analyze it directly if provided complete access. Third, a comprehensive and appropriately interpreted toxicology analysis, one that incorporates decomposition rather than displaying a raw measurement devoid of framework. None of these demand conjecture, they demand disclosure and availability. Nothing beyond that. To be entirely balanced, no offense has been established here, nobody has been prosecuted. The independent determination remains undetermined, and nothing in this presentation asserts otherwise. What's uncontested is that a determination was announced publicly before the analysis was even finalized, and that singular action is what initiated this complete discussion. The family isn't insisting on a suspect or a prosecution. They're requesting something that should be considerably simpler to supply: recorded, disclosed, confirmable truth, disclose the documentation, provide access to the retained tissue, complete the toxicology appropriately. Whatever the evidence demonstrates, whether it indicates an accident or something altogether different, the family merits a resolution they can genuinely trust. You stayed until the end. You heard Nolan's name. You heard Dr. Melanek's assessment. You heard the frustration. You felt the injustice. Now do the only thing that makes sense. Subscribe. Because he deserves to be remembered, and we can't do that without you. The only way stories like this continue to be told is if people like you choose to care, choose to stay, choose to be part of the community that won't let go. So here's what I'm asking, and I'm not asking lightly if this case stayed with you, if that missing neck block is still eating at you. If you believe Nolan Wells deserves justice, subscribe, share this video, drop a comment, tell us which moment stopped you cold. The diagnosis of exclusion, the 12 by 8 inch discoloration, the missing neck structures, the toxicology limitations, the sheriff's early statement, the independent autopsy finding of undetermined. We read every single one. We want to know where you're watching from, and until next time, the truth is patient, and so are we. We'll see you in the next one.